Before we start tonight, if you're new here, welcome to the Scary Collector. Every story in this compilation is presented as it was told to me, by the people who lived through it or by the people left behind to tell it. Some names have been changed. Some details have been softened only slightly because the truth was worse. I'd recommend headphones, a locked door, and maybe leave one light on. 13 stories tonight. 13 doors we're going to open one at a time. Let's begin with the first one. Story 1. The Babysitter Who Wasn't Alone. I was 19 when it happened, working my way through community college by babysitting for a family 2 streets over from my parents' house. The Hendersons. Nice people. 2 kids. A boy, 6, and a girl, 4. And a house that always smelled like cinnamon because the mother baked constantly, like it was a nervous habit rather than a hobby. I'd been sitting for them almost a year by the time it happened, so I knew the house the way you know your own skin. I knew which stair creaked, the 4th one from the top, and which hallway light flickered if you didn't jiggle the switch just right. I knew the kids' routines down to the minute. Bath at 7. Story at 7:30. Lights out at 8. It was easy money and I liked the family, and none of that matters now except to tell you that I was not a nervous kid. I did not scare easily. I want you to understand that because what happened that night still doesn't make sense to me, and I've had years to turn it over. It was October, a Tuesday, unseasonably warm for that time of year, the kind of warm that makes the crickets stay out too late. The parents left around 6 for a work dinner they said would run until 11, maybe midnight. Standard drill. I got the kids fed, bathed, into pajamas, read them 2 chapters of whatever fantasy book the boy was obsessed with that month, and had them both asleep by 8:15. I settled onto the couch downstairs with my textbook and the TV on low, some sitcom rerun I wasn't really watching. Around 9, I heard footsteps upstairs. Not unusual, sometimes the boy got up to use the bathroom. I called up, "You okay, bud?" No answer. I went up, checked his room. He was fast asleep, blanket kicked half off like always. Checked the girl's room, also asleep. I chalked it up to the house settling, went back downstairs. At 9:40 I heard it again. Footsteps. Slower this time and heavier than a 6-year-old's. I remember standing up from the couch so fast I knocked my textbook to the floor. I stood at the bottom of the stairs and listened. Nothing. Then, from directly above me, the sound of someone walking unhurried from the hallway toward the master bedroom. I told myself it was the house. Old houses make noise. I'd read that Pipe's contract would settles all of that. So I went up the stairs, skipping the 4th step out of habit, and I checked every room. Boy's room, asleep. Girl's room, asleep. Master bedroom, empty. Bed made, exactly as the mother had left it. Bathroom, empty. Closets, I even checked the closets, feeling stupid the entire time, but checking them anyway. Nothing. Nobody. I went back downstairs and did something I don't usually do. I called my mom, just to hear another voice. We talked for maybe 20 minutes about nothing, and I felt better, calmer, and I told myself I'd imagined it, that a 19-year-old alone in a quiet house at night is going to hear things that aren't there. 10:15, the girl started crying upstairs. I went up immediately. She was sitting up in bed, and when I asked what was wrong, she said, very calmly, in that flat way little kids say terrifying things without understanding what they're saying, "The lady told me to stop kicking my blanket off. She said it makes the room too cold for her." I felt the hair go up on my arms. I asked her what lady. She pointed at the rocking chair in the corner of her room, a chair that had been in that family for 3 generations, that nobody sat in, that was purely decorative, and said, "She was sitting right there. She left when you came in." I did the thing every babysitter does in that moment. I told myself it was a dream. I told her it was a dream. I tucked her back in, left the door open a crack, left the hallway light on, and went back downstairs, and I sat on that couch with every light in the living room on and did not move for the rest of the night. The parents got home at 11:40. I told the mother what happened, feeling foolish even as the words came out of my mouth. I expected her to laugh it off. Instead, her face went very still, very pale, and she asked me to sit down. She told me that the house had belonged to her husband's grandmother, and that the grandmother had died in the master bedroom. In that same bed the mother slept in every night, nearly 15 years before they'd moved in. She told me that this wasn't the first time, that the boy, when he was 3, used to talk about a lady who watched him sleep, that they'd stopped telling people because people always looked at them like they were insane, or worse, like they were bad parents for staying in a house like that with 2 young kids. "We just try not to talk about it," she said. "She's never hurt anyone. She just doesn't like when things are out of place." I finished out the school year with that family, but I never sat for them again after Christmas. Not because anything else happened. Nothing did, not directly to me. But because I couldn't stop thinking about that empty rocking chair and the calm, matter-of-fact way a 4-year-old had described a woman who wasn't supposed to be there. Before that Christmas break, though, there was one more night I haven't told anyone the full details of, not even my own mother. It was early December, and the parents were out at a company party. I'd gotten the kids down early, and I was in the kitchen washing the dinner dishes when I heard the rocking chair upstairs begin to creak. Slow, even unmistakable, the specific rhythmic sound of wood rocking against a hardwood floor. I stood at that sink with my hands frozen in soapy water, listening to it continue, back and forth, for almost 10 full minutes. I did not go up and check. I want to be honest about that. 19 years old, alone in that house, and I simply could not make my legs carry me up those stairs. I turned the kitchen radio up loud enough to drown it out and stayed downstairs until the creaking finally stopped on its own, sometime around 9:30. When the parents got home, I didn't mention it. I told myself if I said it out loud, it would become more real than I could handle. I ran into the mother years later, at a grocery store, long after I'd moved away and started my own life. I asked carefully if anything else had ever happened. She told me they'd sold the house not long after I stopped babysitting. She said the last straw was finding the rocking chair moved to the middle of the girls' room one morning, facing the bed, when no one, she swore no one, had touched it. She also told me something I hadn't known, that in the weeks before they finally decided to sell, the boy had started drawing pictures at school of the lady in the chair, always rendered the same way in crayon, a thin woman in a long gray dress with her hands folded in her lap. His teacher had actually called the mother in for a concerned meeting about it, assuming it was some kind of trauma response, before the mother quietly explained that no, there wasn't any trauma, just a house with a very old resident who apparently liked to be drawn. I still think about that house sometimes. I think about the 4th stair that creaked, and the hallway light that needed jiggling, and I wonder if whoever lives there now has learned those same small rules of the house yet. And I wonder if they've met the lady in the rocking chair. I hope, for their sake, that she still doesn't like when things are out of place. Story 2. The House on Mill Creek Road. My grandfather used to tell this story every Thanksgiving, and every year my aunts would tell him to stop, that it wasn't appropriate for the kids, and every year he told it anyway, a little quieter, leaning across the table like he was letting us in on a secret. I'm going to tell it to you the way he told it to me. In 1962, when he was a young man just out of the service, my grandfather took a job as a hired hand on a farm at the end of Mill Creek Road, working for an old widower named Elias who owned about 200 acres and not much else. Elias was strange, my grandfather said. Not cruel, not unkind, but strange in a way that made the other farmhands quit within a week or two, one after another, until my grandfather was the only one left who'd stay past a month. The farmhouse had a room at the end of the upstairs hallway that Elias kept locked at all times, and the rule from day one was simple. Don't go near that door, don't ask about that door, and if you hear anything from behind that door at night, put your head under your pillow and wait for morning. My grandfather, being young and stubborn and not particularly good at following rules he didn't understand, lasted about 3 weeks before his curiosity got the better of him. He said the first time he heard it, he told himself it was an animal that had gotten into the walls, a raccoon maybe, or a bird, a soft scratching, rhythmic, coming from behind that locked door, always starting a little after midnight and stopping right around 2 in the morning, like something on a schedule. He asked Elias about it once, over breakfast, trying to sound casual. Elias just kept eating his eggs and said, "That's my wife's room. Leave it be." My grandfather knew Elias's wife had died years before he'd ever arrived at the farm. He didn't ask again. The scratching became something my grandfather got used to, the way you get used to any strange noise you decide not to investigate. But about 2 months into the job, the scratching changed. It became knocking, slow, deliberate knocking, 3 raps and then silence, 3 raps and then silence, all night long, every night, for almost a week straight. My grandfather said he started sleeping with a kitchen knife under his pillow, not because he thought it would help against whatever was behind that door, but because it made him feel like he had options, even if he didn't. The knocking stopped as suddenly as it started, and for a while things went quiet. My grandfather almost let himself forget about it. Then, one night in early autumn, Elias didn't come down for dinner. My grandfather went looking for him and found him standing outside the locked door at the end of the hallway. Just standing there, hand flat against the wood, not moving, not speaking. My grandfather asked if he was all right. Elias turned around, and my grandfather said his face looked like a man who hadn't slept in a decade, hollow and gray. Elias said very quietly, "She wants to come out tonight. She hasn't wanted that in a long time." My grandfather didn't know what to say to that. He helped Elias down to the kitchen, made him a cup of coffee he didn't drink, and sat with him until nearly midnight, when Elias finally seemed to settle and told my grandfather to go on to bed, that everything was fine. My grandfather went up to his room, which was directly across the hall from the locked door, and he lay there in the dark, wide awake, listening. Around 1 in the morning, he heard the door handle at the end of the hall begin to turn. Slowly, testing it. Not the frantic rattling of someone locked in and desperate. Deliberate, patient, like whoever was on the other side had all the time in the world and was simply confirming, once more, that the door was still locked. My grandfather said he did not move a single muscle for almost 3 hours. He listened to that door handle turn, stop, turn again at long, irregular intervals until finally, sometime before dawn, it stopped for good and he fell into an exhausted sleep. In the morning, Elias was gone. Not dead, gone as in, his truck was gone, half his clothes were gone, and there was a note on the kitchen table addressed to my grandfather that simply said, "Take what pay is owed you from the tin in the pantry. Don't go near that room. I mean it. My grandfather took the money and left that same day. He never went back, and as far as he knew, nobody ever heard from Elias again. Years later, doing some digging out of morbid curiosity, my grandfather found out that Elias's wife hadn't simply died of illness like everyone assumed. She died in that upstairs room, and there had been questions at the time, questions that were never fully answered, about whether her death had been entirely natural. There was one more detail my grandfather only told once, the very last time he ever told this story before he passed, and even then he told it quietly, almost like he regretted bringing it up at all. He said that about 10 years after leaving the farm, driving through that same county on unrelated business, curiosity got the better of him and he detoured down Mill Creek Road to see what had become of the old place. The farmhouse was still standing, though clearly abandoned, windows broken, the porch sagging. He said he pulled over, and against every ounce of good sense he had, walked up to that house and looked through a gap in the boarded-up front window. He said the upstairs hallway was visible from that angle, just barely, in the dim light coming through the broken roof. And the door at the end of the hallway, the locked door, was standing wide open. Not broken open, not forced. Open, like someone had simply turned the handle and walked out. He said he did not go inside to look closer. He got back in his truck and drove away, and he never went near that road again for the rest of his life. My grandfather always ended the story the same way, every single Thanksgiving. He'd lean back in his chair and say, "I don't know what was behind that door. I don't want to know. But I know a locked door only means something is being kept in, or something is being kept out, and either one of those is reason enough to leave it be." Story 3. The Night Shift at Blackwood General. I worked nights as an orderly at a hospital for 6 years before I finally quit, and not because of the pay or the hours or the exhaustion that never fully leaves your bones when you work overnights. I quit because of room 214, and because of what I saw there on a Tuesday in February that I still can't fully explain. Hospitals at night are their own kind of strange even without anything supernatural involved. The lights are dimmer. The hallways stretch longer than they do during the day. You hear things. Machines beeping, patients moaning in their sleep, the soft squeak of nurses' shoes on linoleum. And after a while, you learn which sounds are normal and which ones make the hair on your arms stand up. Room 214 was on the 3rd floor, in the older wing of the hospital, the part that hadn't been renovated since the 70s. It was a single room usually used for long-term patients, and every nurse and orderly who'd worked there longer than I had some story about it. Nothing dramatic at first, call lights that turned on in empty rooms, a cold spot right by the window that the maintenance crew could never explain no matter how many times they checked the vents. I'd worked there 2 years before anything happened to me directly, and honestly, I'd started to think the stories were just hospital folklore, the kind of thing tired night shift staff tell each other to stay awake. The patient in 214 that February was an elderly man named Mr. Doyle, 83 years old, in the final stages of a long illness, mostly unconscious, kept comfortable rather than treated for a cure that wasn't coming. I'd check on him every hour or so, standard rounds, nothing out of the ordinary. Around 2 in the morning, on a night I remember specifically because the whole floor was unusually quiet, I went in to check his vitals and found him sitting up in bed. Sitting up, eyes open, looking directly at the corner of the room near the window, which shouldn't have been possible. He hadn't had the strength to sit up on his own in almost 2 weeks. I asked if he was all right, and he turned his head toward me, slowly like it cost him something, and said, in a voice. I looked at the corner of the room. There was nothing there. Just the window, the blinds, the dark parking lot beyond it. I told him it was probably a dream, got him settled back down, checked his vitals, which were, if anything, slightly better than they'd been earlier that shift, and left the room feeling more unsettled than I wanted to admit. I mentioned it to the charge nurse on duty, an older woman named Carol who'd worked that floor for almost 20 years. She didn't seem surprised at all. She just nodded slowly and said, "That's the corner by the window. People see her right before." I asked her right before what. She just looked at me and said, "You'll see." Mr. Doyle passed away 3 days later, quietly in his sleep, during the day shift, so I wasn't there for it. But I couldn't stop thinking about what he'd said, and about Carol's face when she told me I'd see. About 6 weeks after that, room 214 had a new patient, a woman in her 60s recovering from a serious surgery, expected to make a full recovery, nothing life-threatening about her situation at all. I was doing rounds around 3 in the morning when I heard her call light go off. I went in and she was sitting up, agitated, pointing at the same corner of the room by the window. "There's someone standing there," she said. "A woman. She won't say anything. She's just standing there watching me." I did what I was trained to do. I reassured her, checked the room, told her it was probably a shadow or the medication playing tricks on her perception, all the standard things you say to a frightened patient at 3 in the morning. But my hands were shaking when I left that room, because I recognized the exact spot she was pointing to. The exact same corner. The exact same description. That patient made a full recovery and was discharged a week later, completely fine, so whatever Carol meant by right before, it clearly wasn't a universal rule. But I couldn't shake it. I started asking around, carefully, not wanting to seem unstable to my coworkers, and I found at least 4 other staff members over the years who'd had similar experiences in that exact room. Patients describing a woman standing in that corner by the window, always silent, always just watching. One of the older nurses finally told me the rest of it, the part nobody talked about openly. Decades ago, before the renovation, that wing of the hospital had a different layout, and the space that was now the corner of room 214 had once been much closer to what was, at the time, the hospital's small in-house morgue holding area, the space where bodies were kept briefly before being transferred to the funeral home. Before I transferred, one more thing happened that I still haven't fully made peace with. On my second-to-last night shift on that floor, I was doing my 3 a.m. rounds and I passed room 214, empty at the time, between patients waiting to be cleaned and reassigned. The door was supposed to be closed. It was standing open just a few inches, and the room beyond it was dark except for a faint, cold light coming from that corner by the window, a light that didn't match anything in the room, no monitor, no night light, nothing that should have been producing it. I stood in that doorway for what felt like a long time, and I swear, even now, that I saw the faint outline of a woman standing exactly where every patient had described her, facing away from me, toward the window, completely still. I did not go in. I pulled the door shut, finished my rounds without stopping again, and did not look back. I don't know what to do with that information except to tell you that I put in my transfer request not long after, and I've worked days ever since. I still think about Mr. Doyle sometimes, about the way he spoke to that corner like he was having a perfectly normal conversation with an old acquaintance. And I think about Carol's voice, flat and certain, telling me, "You'll see." I did, and I never want to see it again. Story 4. The Man in the Rearview Mirror. I drove long-haul trucking routes for almost a decade, and if you talk to enough truckers, you'll find that almost every single one of them has a story like this. Something that happened on a long night drive, alone, on a stretch of highway with nothing around for miles. This is mine. It was a winter run, hauling freight from Ohio down through the mountains toward the Carolinas, a route I'd driven probably 50 times before without incident. I liked night driving, less traffic, cooler engine, and honestly, I liked the quiet. Just me, the radio, and the hum of the road. Around 1 in the morning, somewhere in the mountains, deep into a stretch where the cell signal drops and the only lights you see for an hour at a time are your own headlights carving through the fog, I glanced up at my rearview mirror out of habit, the way you do 100 times an hour without even thinking about it, and I saw a man sitting in the sleeper cab behind me. I want to be clear, I was alone. I checked the cab before I left the last rest stop, the way I always did, out of routine more than paranoia. There was no one back there. And yet, in that mirror, I told myself it was exhaustion. Truckers know about the tricks a tired mind plays on long night drives. The phenomenon they call highway hypnosis, where your brain starts to hallucinate shapes and figures out of shadows and fatigue. I pulled into the next rest stop, splashed water on my face, walked around the truck a few times to wake myself up, and got back on the road, telling myself it was nothing. About 40 minutes later, deep in the same stretch of mountain highway, my radio, which had been playing static-laced country music the whole drive, cut out completely. Not slowly fading the way it does when you lose a signal. Instantly silent, like someone had reached over and turned the dial themselves. And in the silence, I heard a voice from the sleeper cab behind me. Just one sentence, low, almost conversational, like he'd been part of the conversation the whole time. He said, "You shouldn't have looked twice." I don't remember consciously deciding to pull over. I just remember doing it. Swerving onto the shoulder so hard the trailer fishtailed, throwing the truck into park, and getting out into the freezing mountain air so fast I didn't even grab my jacket. I stood outside that truck for I don't know how long, shaking, staring at it, absolutely certain that if I got back in, I would not be alone. Eventually another truck slowed down and pulled over behind me. Another driver, a guy named Russ who I'd crossed paths with a few times at various stops over the years, asking if I'd broken down. I must have looked like a wreck, because he didn't ask twice before offering to check the cab with me. We went through that truck together, every inch of it, the sleeper cab, the small storage compartments, everywhere a person could conceivably hide. There was nobody there, nothing out of place. My radio, when I turned the key, came back on immediately, playing the same station like nothing had ever happened. Russ didn't laugh at me, which I appreciated more than I can say. He just nodded slowly and said that stretch of highway had a reputation among long-haul drivers, that a trucker had died there decades earlier, jackknifed his rig in bad weather on a curve about 6 miles up the road, and that more than a few drivers over the years had reported strange things happening on that exact stretch, always late at night, always around that same mile marker. I finished that route. I had a delivery deadline and honestly, sitting on the shoulder of a mountain highway at 2 in the morning didn't feel any safer than driving, but I kept the radio on the entire rest of the way, volume up loud, and I did not look in that rearview mirror again until the sun came up. A few years after that night, I ran into Russ again at a truck stop a couple states over, and we got to talking the way you do with someone who shared a strange experience with you once. He told me something I hadn't known, that after helping me that night, he'd gone home and done some digging of his own into the accident he'd mentioned, the trucker who died on that curve. He found an old newspaper clipping about it, decades old, and the description of the driver who died, down to a specific detail about a flannel jacket he'd been known for wearing. Matched, almost exactly, a fleeting glimpse Russ said he'd caught of a figure standing at the tree line while we were searching my truck that night, a glimpse he'd never mentioned to me at the time because he didn't want to make things worse. He said he hadn't driven that stretch at night since either, not if he could help it, rerouting an extra 40 minutes rather than risk it. Hearing that from someone else, someone who hadn't heard the voice himself but had seen something all the same, made the whole thing feel more solid in a way I wasn't prepared for. It's one thing to doubt your own tired mind at 2 in the morning. It's another thing entirely when someone else's account lines up with yours without either of you trying to make it match. I still drive that same stretch of highway sometimes years later, and I won't lie to you, every single time right around that same mile marker, I turn the radio up a little louder than I need to, and I keep my eyes locked straight ahead on the road. Some habits, once you learn them the hard way, you never unlearn. Story 5. The Basement Tapes. When my grandmother passed away, my family inherited her house, and along with it, decades of belongings nobody had bothered to sort through while she was alive. Boxes in the attic, boxes in the garage, and boxes, dozens of them, in the basement, filled mostly with old VHS tapes my grandfather had recorded before he passed away years earlier. Home movies, mostly birthdays and holidays and school plays. I volunteered to go through the basement boxes myself, thinking it would be a nice way to say goodbye to her, watching old footage of a family I only half remembered from childhood. My wife thought it was a good idea too. Neither of us thought much about it beyond that. Most of the tapes were exactly what you'd expect. Grainy, dated home movies, my grandfather's voice narrating awkwardly from behind the camera. My mother as a teenager rolling her eyes at being filmed, the kind of footage that makes you laugh and feel a little sad all at once. I worked through maybe 20 tapes over a couple of weekends, digitizing the ones worth keeping, tossing the ones that were too damaged to salvage. Then I got to a tape with no label. Just a strip of masking tape on the spine with a date written on it in my grandfather's handwriting. No title, nothing else. I remember thinking that was strange because he labeled everything meticulously, almost obsessively. Every other tape had a full description. This one just had the date. I put it in the player expecting more of the same. Instead, the footage opened on total darkness, just black, for almost 30 seconds, long enough that I checked to make sure the tape was actually playing. Then a light flicked on, the basement light, the same basement I was sitting in while I watched it, which I didn't clock until later and which still makes my skin crawl to think about, and the camera was pointed at a wall. Just a blank wall, the same cinderblock wall that was, at that exact moment, about 6 feet behind where I was sitting. The footage held on that wall for almost 2 full minutes. No narration, no movement, nothing. Then, faintly, from off camera, I heard my grandfather's voice. Younger than I remembered it, tense in a way I'd never heard him, saying, "I don't think it likes the camera." The footage cut. When it came back, the angle had changed slightly, like the camera had been moved, and now it was pointed at the far corner of the basement. A corner that, in the actual basement I was sitting in, had been walled off and converted into a small utility closet sometime in the 80s, long before I was born. In the footage, that corner wasn't walled off yet. It was open, and there was something standing in it. I want to describe it accurately, and I want to be honest that it's hard to, because the footage was old and grainy and the basement light back then wasn't strong. But there was a shape in that corner, roughly the height and build of a person, except it was wrong somehow, too still, too tall in a way that didn't match human proportions, and its head was tilted at an angle that made my stomach turn just looking at it. My grandfather's voice, off camera, said something I couldn't make out, and then the shape moved. Not walked, moved in a single fluid motion closer to the camera, and the tape cut to static. I sat there in that basement, alone, tape still hissing static from the speakers, and I did not move for what felt like a very long time. When I finally got up the nerve to turn around and look at that same corner, the utility closet, walled off now, perfectly ordinary drywall and a door with a mop bucket behind it, I felt colder than the actual temperature of that basement could account for. I showed the tape to my mother later, hoping she'd have some explanation, some memory of what it was. She went pale watching it and told me she remembered, vaguely, being a young girl and being told very firmly by both her parents to never, under any circumstances, go into the basement alone after dark. She said she'd always assumed it was a normal parental safety rule. Nothing more. She had no memory of the tape itself, no idea it existed, and she asked me, quietly, to never show it to her again. I never did figure out what my grandfather filmed that night, or why he filmed it at all if it frightened him enough to never speak of it again, or why he kept the tape rather than destroying it. Maybe some part of him needed proof, even proof he never intended to show anyone, that what he'd experienced was real. We sold that house not long after settling the estate. I didn't say anything to the new owners about the basement, partly because I didn't know what I would even say, and partly because I told myself, the way you do, that whatever was in that footage belonged to a different time and had nothing to do with the present. I still have the tape. I've never watched it again. Some things, once you've seen them, you don't need to see twice to remember exactly how they made you feel. Story 6. The Hitchhiker on Route 9. This happened to my uncle when he was in his 20s, and he only ever told the story once that I know of, at a family gathering when he'd had a few drinks and the conversation had drifted, as it does, towards strange things that had happened to people we knew. He told it once, and then he never brought it up again, and none of us ever pushed him to. He was driving home late one night along Route 9, a rural stretch of road that cuts through mostly farmland and forest for about 40 miles between two small towns. The kind of road where you can drive for 20 minutes without seeing another car. It was raining hard, the kind of rain that makes your wipers useless even on the highest setting, and he was going slow, more cautious than usual because visibility was so poor. He said he saw her from a distance, a young woman standing on the shoulder of the road, no umbrella, no raincoat, soaked through, thumb out. He almost didn't stop. He said something about her felt wrong even from a distance, though he couldn't have told you what exactly. But it was pouring rain, the middle of nowhere, and he told himself he'd feel guilty leaving anyone out there in that weather. So he pulled over. She got in without saying much, just a quiet thank you, and gave him an address a few towns over. He said she was polite, unremarkable in conversation, the kind of hitchhiker you'd forget about within a week under normal circumstances. Except for one detail that he said he noticed almost immediately and could not stop noticing for the entire drive. Despite being soaked from head to toe, she wasn't dripping onto his seats. Not a drop. Her clothes were visibly wet, plastered to her skin, but nothing was coming off of them. He said he told himself he was imagining it, that the lighting in the car was playing tricks on him, and he kept driving, making small talk to fill the silence, trying to ignore the increasingly uncomfortable feelings settling into his chest. About 15 minutes into the drive, she asked him if he knew the old Miller farmhouse, a landmark a few miles up the road that had burned down years before he was even born. He only knew of it because his own father had mentioned it once in passing. When he told her he didn't know it well, she said quietly, almost to herself, "That's where I grew up, before the fire." He said something shifted in the car after that, a feeling he couldn't articulate except to say the temperature seemed to drop, and the hair on his arms stood straight up. He glanced over at her, and for just a moment, he swore, just a single moment, her reflection in the passenger window didn't match her. The window showed an empty seat. He said he didn't scream, didn't swerve, didn't do anything dramatic. He just gripped the wheel tighter and kept driving, telling himself it was a trick of the rain-streaked glass, refusing to look at that window again. When he finally reached the address she'd given him, a small, dark house set back from the road, no lights on inside, he pulled into the driveway and turned to tell her they'd arrived. The passenger seat was empty, door still closed, no sound of it opening, nothing, just empty and dry, like no one had ever sat there at all. My uncle said he didn't drive away immediately, which surprised all of us when he told the story, because every instinct in your body would tell you to leave. Instead, he said he sat there for a moment, staring at that empty seat, and then he did something he still couldn't fully explain. He got out of the car, walked up to the dark house, and knocked on the door. An elderly man answered, and my uncle, stammering, asked if a young woman lived there. The man's face changed the moment he asked, going pale in the porch light, and he asked my uncle to describe her. When my uncle did, down to the color of the raincoat she wasn't wearing, the details he could remember, the old man went very quiet and told him that description matched his daughter exactly, who had died in a house fire at the old Miller property almost 15 years earlier, on a night, the old man said, very much like this one. My uncle didn't stay to hear more. He got back in his car and drove straight home, and he told us he checked that back seat in his rearview mirror every few seconds for the entire rest of the drive, half expecting to see her sitting there again. She never appeared. Years later, my cousin, who was a little more stubborn and a little less easily rattled than the rest of us, actually drove out to that stretch of Route 9 on a dare, mostly to prove to himself the story was exaggerated. He didn't see anything unusual, no hitchhikers, no strange passengers, nothing at all, except that when he passed the old address my uncle had described, the address of that dark farmhouse where the old man had answered the door, he found nothing there at all. No house, just an empty, overgrown lot, with a foundation barely visible beneath years of weeds, consistent, according to county records he checked afterward, with a structure that had been demolished decades earlier, years before my uncle's drive ever took place. When my cousin brought this up to my uncle, expecting him to have some explanation, my uncle just went quiet for a long moment and said he didn't want to talk about it, and he never has since, not even when pressed. He never drove Route 9 at night again after that, not once, not even when it would have saved him 20 minutes on his commute. And to this day, none of us bring up hitchhikers around him if we can help it, because the one time someone made a joke about it at a barbecue years later, my uncle just got very quiet, set down his drink, and walked inside without a word. Story 7. The Doll in the Attic. We bought our house 4 years ago, an older colonial with a lot of character. The kind of place real estate listings describe as having original charm, which is often a polite way of saying old and slightly strange. It had a small attic space accessible through a pull-down ladder in the hallway ceiling, mostly used for storage, and we didn't think much about it beyond that for the first year or so we lived there. My daughter was 5 when we moved in, and within the first few weeks, she started talking about a doll in the attic. We hadn't been up there. We'd been told by the previous owners it was mostly empty, just some old insulation and a few boxes of holiday decorations they'd left behind. So we assumed she'd overheard something, or was making it up the way kids do. But she was specific about it in a way that started to unsettle my wife more than it unsettled me, at least at first. She described a porcelain doll with a blue dress and dark hair, sitting near the small attic window, and she said it watched the house at night. When we asked how she knew what was in the attic, since none of us had ever taken her up there, she just shrugged and said, "She told me." We chalked it up to imagination for months. Kids invent things. Kids have imaginary friends. It didn't seem worth losing sleep over, even though, if I'm honest, it did start creeping into my thoughts more than I wanted to admit, especially at night when the house was quiet and I could hear the attic ladder creak occasionally with the temperature changes, the way old houses do. Eventually, out of curiosity more than anything else, my wife and I pulled down the attic ladder and went up to look for ourselves, mostly to prove to our daughter, and honestly to ourselves, that there was nothing up there. The attic was small, low-ceilinged, mostly empty except for a few boxes left by the previous owners exactly as promised. But near the small round window at the far end, half covered by an old moving blanket, was a doll. Porcelain. Blue dress, faded with age. Dark hair, matted slightly with dust. Sitting upright, propped against the window frame, facing out into the attic space, exactly as our daughter had described, down to details she could not possibly have known unless she'd actually seen it, which, as far as we knew, she never had. I won't pretend that didn't shake us. My wife wanted to throw it away immediately. I agreed, and we bagged it up and put it out with the trash that same week, feeling relieved to be rid of it, telling ourselves that would be the end of it. It wasn't. About 2 weeks later, my daughter mentioned the doll again, casually over breakfast, saying the lady was upset that we'd put her outside in the cold. I remember my coffee cup stopping halfway to my mouth. We hadn't told her we'd thrown anything away. We hadn't told her about the doll at all beyond the initial conversation months earlier. I went up to the attic that same day, half expecting, half dreading what I might find. The doll was back. Same spot, same position, facing the window like it had never left. I did some digging after that, mostly out of a need to understand rather than pure curiosity. I found the previous owner's contact information through our real estate agent and called them, feeling a little foolish, and asked if they knew anything about a doll left in the attic. There was a long pause on the line before the previous owner, an older woman, said quietly, "We left that on purpose. We tried getting rid of it twice. It always came back." She told me the house had belonged to her husband's family for 3 generations, and that the doll had belonged to a daughter who died young, decades before my family had ever moved in, from an illness that, in that era, took far too many children far too young. The doll had apparently sat in that same attic window ever since, and every attempt by every subsequent owner to remove it had ended the same way. The doll simply reappearing, always in that exact spot, always facing that exact window. She told me the previous family had eventually stopped fighting it and just let it be, and that nothing bad had ever happened as a direct result as far as she knew, just the quiet, unshakable sense of being watched, and the occasional comment from young children in the house about a lady who liked to look out the window at night. We've left it alone ever since. My daughter is 9 now, and she doesn't mention the doll much anymore, though every so often, usually around her birthday, she'll say something offhand about the lady in the attic wishing her a happy birthday, and my wife and I just look at each other and don't say anything because there isn't really anything to say. We've never gone back up to check on it again. We don't need to. We know it's there. And some nights, when the house creaks in that particular way old houses do, I find myself glancing up at the ceiling, toward that small pull-down ladder, and wondering if she's watching the house right now, the way she apparently always has. There is one more thing I should mention. Something my wife pointed out that I hadn't considered until she said it out loud one night, and it's stuck with me ever since. Our daughter's birthday falls on a date almost identical, off by only 2 days according to the town records we eventually tracked down, to the date the previous family's little girl died, decades ago, of the illness that took her. My wife doesn't think that's a coincidence, and honestly, neither do I anymore, though I couldn't begin to tell you what it means. We've never brought it up to our daughter directly. Some things, I think, are better left as a quiet, private unease between two parents lying awake at night than a question you actually ask your child out loud. Story 8. The last camping trip. 4 of us went camping in a stretch of national forest up north, a trip we'd done every summer for almost 6 years running. Always the same group of college friends trying to hold on to something before adult life pulled us in different directions. We knew that particular trail well. We'd hiked it a dozen times. Nothing about that trip should have been different from any other. We set up camp a few miles in, at a clearing we'd used before, far enough from the trailhead that we had the place to ourselves, which was part of the appeal. No cell signal out there, which normally felt like a relief rather than a concern. The first night was ordinary. A fire, drinks, the kind of conversation that only happens when you're deep enough into the woods that the outside world stops mattering. We turned in around midnight, 2 tents, 2 people each, nothing unusual. I woke up sometime after 2 in the morning to the sound of footsteps circling the campsite. Slow, deliberate crunching over dry leaves and pine needles in a wide loop around our tents. I lay there, frozen, listening, telling myself it was a deer or a raccoon, some ordinary forest animal drawn by the smell of our dinner. But the pacing was too even, too rhythmic, too much like a person walking a perimeter. I woke my tent mate, one of my closest friends, and we lay there together in silence, listening to those footsteps circle us, slow and unhurried, for what felt like an hour but was probably closer to 20 minutes. Eventually they stopped, and we didn't hear anything else for the rest of the night. In the morning we told the other 2 what we'd heard, and they laughed it off, said we'd probably just heard a deer, that we were being paranoid. That night all 4 of us heard it. The same slow, circling footsteps, starting a little after 2 in the morning again. Like clockwork. Nobody laughed it off this time. We all lay in our tents, absolutely silent, listening to something walk around our campsite in a wide, patient loop, for almost 30 minutes before it stopped. In the morning, one of my friends found something that ended any remaining doubt about whether we'd imagined it. Footprints. Human footprints, bare feet, unusually large, circling the entire campsite in a perfect, deliberate loop, exactly matching the path we'd heard the footsteps take. No shoe tread, no boot marks, just bare feet pressed into the soft dirt, evenly spaced, like whoever made them had walked that loop at a slow, steady pace all night. We should have packed up and left right then. I think about that a lot, honestly, how obvious the right decision was and how none of us made it. Instead, stubbornly, stupidly, we told ourselves it was probably some other camper messing with us, a prank, and we decided to stay one more night, deciding as a group to keep the fire burning and take turns keeping watch. Around 1 in the morning on that third night, the person on watch, one of my friends, woke the rest of us up, whispering that something was standing at the tree line, just past the edge of our fire's light, watching the camp. We all came out of our tents together, huddled close, staring into the darkness at the edge of the clearing, and for a moment, none of us could see anything at all. Then the fire cracked, throwing light a little further out, and I saw it, or thought I saw it, and to this day I still argue with myself about which. A tall, impossibly thin shape standing motionless between two trees, easily 7 feet, maybe taller, limbs too long for its body, head tilted at an angle that made my stomach drop. It didn't move. It didn't need to. Just the sight of it standing there, watching us with a stillness that felt deliberate rather than natural, sent all 4 of us scrambling to break camp in the dark, stuffing gear haphazardly into bags, not caring what we left behind. We hiked out that night in pitch darkness, using our phone flashlights, moving faster than I've ever moved on a trail before or since. None of us speaking except to say which direction to go. We didn't look back. Every one of us has admitted, separately, in the years since, that we were too afraid to look back, certain that whatever was watching us from the tree line was following, even though none of us heard footsteps behind us on that hike out. We made it to the trailhead a little before dawn, exhausted, filthy, and none of us have gone back to that stretch of forest since, despite it being, for 6 years running, our favorite place on earth. We looked into it afterward, cautiously, and found old local reports, some official, most just word of mouth from other hikers and hunters, describing similar experiences in that same general area over the decades. Circling footsteps at night, tall, silent figures at the edge of firelight. Nothing that ever escalated into direct harm, as far as anyone could tell, but nothing that ever felt like it needed to escalate for you to understand you needed to leave. About a year after that trip, one of my friends, the one who'd been keeping watch the night we saw the figure, sent the rest of us a link to a local news archive almost at midnight, no message attached, just the link. It was a short article, nearly 15 years old, about a hiker who had gone missing in that same section of forest and was never found, despite an extensive search effort that lasted almost 2 weeks before being called off. The article mentioned, briefly, that searchers at the time reported strange encounters of their own during the search, sounds of movement at the edges of their camps at night, equipment going missing and reappearing in strange places, one search team even reporting unexplained footprints circling their base camp overnight, matching almost exactly what we'd found circling ours. None of us have said much about it since sending that link back and forth. There wasn't much left to say. We still get together every summer, the 4 of us, but we go somewhere new every year now, somewhere with cell signal and other campers nearby and clearly marked trails. Nobody's ever suggested going back to that clearing. Nobody ever will. Story 9. The Voice on the Baby Monitor. My wife and I had our first child about 3 years ago, and like most new parents, we were exhausted, paranoid, and completely obsessed with the baby monitor, checking it constantly even when there was no reason to think anything was wrong. It became background noise in our lives, that soft static hum coming through the receiver on the nightstand. Our daughter's nursery was down the hall from our bedroom, standard video monitor setup, nothing unusual about it. For the first several months, it worked exactly as expected. We'd hear her stir, hear her cry, watch the grainy black and white feed to check on her without having to get up every single time. About 4 months in, I woke up around 3 in the morning to the monitor crackling with static, louder than usual, the kind of interference that normally meant a neighbor's Wi-Fi or some electronic device nearby was causing signal issues. I almost ignored it, but underneath the static, faintly, I heard something that made me sit straight up in bed. A voice, low, unfamiliar, humming what sounded like a lullaby. Not our daughter's voice, obviously. She was 4 months old. Not my wife's voice. I grabbed the monitor and stared at the grainy video feed. Our daughter was asleep in her crib, exactly as she should have been. Nothing else visible in the frame. But the humming continued, faint and warped through the static, for almost a full minute before cutting out entirely. I told myself it was interference. Some baby monitors, especially older models, are notorious for picking up stray signals from other devices, even in rare and well-documented cases, other baby monitors in nearby houses on the same frequency. That explanation made sense. It was reasonable. I went back to sleep telling myself that and mostly believed it. It happened again 3 nights later. Same time, almost exactly 3 in the morning. Same static, same faint humming, except this time, after about 30 seconds, the humming stopped in a voice. Clearer this time, definitely not just interference. A woman's voice, soft and almost tender, said, "Such a good girl." Almost time. I was out of bed and down the hallway before I even fully processed what I'd heard. Our daughter was asleep, completely fine, nothing out of place in the nursery. I stood there for a long time, monitor in hand, staring at my sleeping daughter, trying to convince myself I'd misheard something, that exhaustion and paranoia were doing exactly what exhaustion and paranoia do to new parents. I didn't tell my wife at first, mostly because I didn't want to scare her, and partly because I genuinely wasn't sure what I'd actually heard versus what my sleep-deprived brain had constructed. But it kept happening, always around 3 in the morning, always that same static, always that same faint humming, occasionally followed by a few words, never anything overtly threatening, but never anything that should have been there either. Things like, "Not much longer now," and once, unsettlingly, "She looks just like her." I finally told my wife after about 2 weeks of this, half expecting her to think I was losing my mind. Instead, her face went pale and she admitted she'd been hearing something too, on the nights she was up for feedings, but had assumed she was too exhausted to trust her own perception and hadn't wanted to worry me. We replaced the monitor immediately, a completely different brand, different frequency, everything. It happened again anyway. On the very first night we used the new one, same static, same time, same faint humming voice. We eventually had an electrician friend come look at the wiring in the nursery, half out of desperation, half because we genuinely didn't know what else to do. He found nothing wrong with the wiring itself, but he mentioned, almost offhand, that the house was old enough that the nursery had likely served as a different room entirely at some point in its history, and a quick record search my wife did out of morbid curiosity that same week turned up something that neither of us have fully processed since. Decades earlier, a young mother had lived in that house with an infant daughter, and according to old local newspaper archives, the infant had died in her sleep in that very room of causes that, at the time, were simply and vaguely attributed to natural causes, the way many infant deaths were in that era. We moved our daughter into a different room after that, one on the opposite side of the house. The static and the humming stopped entirely, and we've never heard it again in the almost 3 years since. There was one final piece of that puzzle that came together almost a year later, something my wife found while helping her own mother sort through old family records for an unrelated reason. Tucked into a folder of old documents was a photocopy of a birth and death record for an infant girl from that same decade, same town, though not, as far as we could ever confirm, actually connected to the house itself. Just close enough in time and geography that my wife couldn't shake the feeling it was related somehow. The infant's name, according to that faded record, was strikingly close to our own daughter's name, close enough that when my wife first read it, she said she had to sit down. We've never told anyone that detail before now. It felt like the kind of thing that, once said out loud, becomes real in a way we weren't ready for. But every so often, late at night, I find myself standing in the doorway of what used to be the nursery, now used as a home office, and I think about that voice saying almost time, and I wonder exactly what it thought it was almost time for. I try not to think about it too hard. Some questions I've learned are better left unanswered. Story 10. The Neighbor Who Never Left. I lived in a duplex for about 2 years right after college, sharing a wall with a neighbor I rarely saw, an older man named Walter who mostly kept to himself. We'd exchange a nod in the driveway occasionally, maybe a brief comment about the weather, but nothing more than that. He seemed like an unremarkable, quiet man, and honestly, I didn't think about him much at all beyond those brief interactions. About 1.5 years into living there, I noticed I hadn't seen him in a while. Weeks, maybe longer. His car hadn't moved from the driveway. I didn't think too much of it at first. People go on trips, people get sick. It wasn't really my business to keep tabs on a neighbor I barely knew. But then, I told myself he'd just gotten home, that I'd missed him coming back, and went to sleep despite the pacing continuing well past midnight. Over the next several nights, it happened again. Always the same slow, shuffling pace, always starting around 11 and continuing for an hour or more. I still hadn't seen his car move, hadn't seen him in the driveway, hadn't seen a single sign of him during daylight hours despite clearly hearing him at night. About a week into this, I ran into the property manager doing routine maintenance on the building and, mostly out of curiosity, asked if Walter was doing all right, mentioning I hadn't seen him around in a while. The property manager's face did something strange, a kind of confused hesitation, before he told me carefully that Walter had passed away almost 3 weeks earlier, found in his unit by a concerned family member after he'd stopped answering calls. Natural causes, an unattended death that had gone unnoticed for several days before anyone checked on him. I stood there in the hallway feeling like the floor had shifted slightly beneath me. 3 weeks. I had been hearing those footsteps, that slow pacing through our shared wall, for well over a week after he'd already died. I told the property manager what I'd been hearing, and to his credit, he didn't dismiss it outright, though I could tell he wanted to. He mentioned that the unit was still being cleared out by family, that maybe someone had been coming by at odd hours to sort through his things, and that was probably what I'd heard. It was a reasonable explanation. I wanted to believe it. But the pacing continued that night, and the night after, always the same time, always the same slow rhythm, and I started noticing something else. It always seemed to pause, briefly, directly across from where my bed was positioned against that shared wall, like whatever was pacing knew exactly where I was lying, before continuing on its route. I asked the property manager directly whether anyone had actually been in that unit at night, and he checked with the family and confirmed. No one had been there after dark at all. The unit had sat completely empty since Walter's body was removed, waiting for the family to finish the estate process before it could be cleared and relisted. I lasted about another 10 days after that before I broke my lease early, eating the fee without a second thought, because by that point, the pacing had started happening earlier and earlier each night, and once, unmistakably, I heard it stop directly at the wall behind my headboard and then heard 3 slow, deliberate knocks against the drywall, evenly spaced, before the pacing resumed. I never went back to that duplex after I moved out, not even to grab a piece of mail I'd forgotten to forward. I looked it up online a couple of years later out of morbid curiosity and found that the unit had changed hands twice since I'd lived there, each tenancy lasting less than a year. I don't know if that means anything. Maybe it's just a coincidence, an older building with normal turnover. I did reach out once, carefully, to one of those later tenants through a mutual friend of a friend, mostly to satisfy my own need to know whether I was the only one. She didn't want to talk about it much, but she confirmed enough. She said she'd only lasted 5 months in that unit before breaking her own lease, and when I asked, gently, if it was because of anything she'd heard at night, she went quiet on the phone for a long moment before saying, simply, the knocking, and asking me not to bring it up again. I didn't push. I understood completely. But I think about those 3 knocks sometimes late at night when my own house is quiet and I find myself unconsciously listening to the walls, half expecting, even now, years later and hundreds of miles away, to hear that same slow, patient pacing starting up again. Story 11. The elevator that shouldn't exist. I worked the night security shift at an old office building downtown for about a year while I was finishing my degree, a job that mostly involved sitting at a front desk, doing rounds every couple of hours and staying awake through very long, very quiet nights. The building was maybe 15 stories, built sometime in the 1970s, with the kind of dated architecture that made it feel perpetually a little dim, even with all the lights on. Part of my job was doing a full walkthrough of the building twice a night, checking that all the doors were locked, all the lights that should be off were off, that kind of routine security check. I knew that building's layout better than I knew my own apartment by the end of my first month, which is why what happened still doesn't sit right with me, even years later. The building had 2 elevators, both original to the building, both perfectly ordinary, servicing all 15 floors. I used them constantly during my rounds, no different from using an elevator anywhere else. About 4 months into the job, doing my usual second-floor walkthrough around 2 in the morning, I noticed something I was certain hadn't been there before. A 3rd elevator door, set into a section of wall near the end of a rarely used hallway, in a part of the building mostly occupied by storage closets and an old, unused conference room. I remember standing in front of it genuinely confused, because I'd walked that exact hallway probably 60 times over the previous 4 months and I would have noticed an entire elevator door. I checked the building directory, the floor plans posted near the stairwell for fire safety purposes. 2 elevators. Only 2 clearly marked, matching the 2 I used every single day. Nothing indicated a 3rd. I stood in front of that door for a long time, telling myself I must have simply never noticed it before, that 4 months wasn't really that long, that old buildings have all kinds of forgotten architectural quirks. I almost walked away, but there was a call button beside it, illuminated faintly, and against every instinct telling me not to, I pressed it. I heard the mechanism engage somewhere behind the wall. A low mechanical groan, like old machinery waking up after a long time dormant, and a few seconds later, the doors slid open. The inside of the elevator was old, far older than the rest of the building's fixtures, with a floor panel showing buttons for levels that didn't match the building's actual floor count. Not floors 1 through 15. Something else entirely, symbols I didn't recognize, arranged in a pattern that made my head hurt slightly trying to focus on it, along with a basement level marked simply with a single dash. I did not get in. I want to be very clear about that because in the moment some deeply stupid, curious part of me actually considered it, the way you consider touching something you know is hot. But the overwhelming instinct that took over instead was simple, primal fear, and I stepped back from that open door and watched it sit there, doors open, waiting, for almost 30 full seconds before sliding shut on its own, with no one having entered. I finished my rounds that night faster than I ever had before, and I did not go back down that particular hallway for the rest of my shift. In the morning, when the day staff arrived, I asked, as casually as I could manage, whether there was a 3rd elevator somewhere in the building that I might not know about. Every single person I asked looked at me like I'd asked something absurd. 2 elevators. There had only ever been 2 elevators, they told me, some of them people who had worked in that building for over a decade. I went back to that hallway the following night, dreading it, needing to know if I'd imagined the whole thing. The wall was blank. Ordinary drywall, painted the same faded beige as the rest of the hallway. No seam, no door, no call button, Nothing to suggest an elevator had ever been there at all. I kept that job for another 8 months, finishing out my degree, and I never saw that door again, no matter how many times I walked that same hallway, half hoping, half dreading that I would. I asked around, cautiously, careful not to sound unhinged, and found one older security guard, retired by that point, who I managed to track down through a mutual coworker. When I described what I'd seen, he went very quiet on the phone for a long moment before telling me, flatly, that he'd seen it too once back in the 80s and that his advice, the only advice he had to offer, was to never, under any circumstances, get in. That retired guard told me one more thing before we hung up that night. Something he said he'd never told anyone else at the company. Worried it would cost him his reputation or his job if word got around. He said that back in the 80s, a fellow guard on his shift had gone missing for almost 6 hours one night, found eventually wandering the building's main lobby at dawn, disoriented, unable to explain where he'd been, with no memory of anything after starting his rounds the previous evening. The official explanation, quietly agreed upon by building management to avoid any liability or scandal, was some kind of medical episode. But the retired guard told me the missing man had, years later, after a lot of drinking one night, confided that he remembered getting into an elevator that didn't belong, and remembered the doors closing, and remembered almost nothing else at all until he found himself standing in that lobby with no idea how much time had passed. I never got the chance to test whether that advice was necessary, and honestly, I've never wanted to. Some doors, I've come to believe, exist for reasons we're not meant to understand, and the only sensible thing to do when you find one is to let it close on its own. Story 12. The text from my dead sister. My older sister died in a car accident 6 years ago, on a rainy October night, on her way home from a friend's house. I won't go into the details of that night. Some things are still too difficult to relive even now, but I want you to understand clearly that she died. There is no ambiguity, no mystery about that fact. I identified her. I attended her funeral. I have spent 6 years living in a world without her in it. Which is why what happened 8 months ago still doesn't have an explanation I can accept, no matter how many times I've turned it over in my mind. It was a Tuesday evening, nothing unusual about the day at all, and I was sitting on my couch scrolling through my phone when a text notification came through. From her name, her old phone number, the same one I deleted from my contacts within the first year after she died because seeing it in my recent calls list was too painful to look at, though I'd never actually blocked the number itself. The message just said, "Hey, are you awake?" I stared at that screen for what felt like an eternity. My first thought, the rational thought, was that her old number had been reassigned to someone new. Phone numbers get recycled after enough time. That's simply how it works, and whoever had that number now was probably just texting a friend or an old contact by mistake. I told myself that, and I believed it mostly. The reply came almost instantly. "It's me. Why does it say Sarah in your phone? Did you change my name?" My hands were shaking by that point. Sarah was my sister's name. I hadn't put that in the text. The contact name would have only shown on my end, not something a stranger with her old number could possibly have known unless, somehow impossibly, they were looking at the same conversation I was. I didn't respond for a long time. I sat there, staring at my phone, feeling something between terror and a desperate, aching hope that I am not proud of, but that I think anyone who has lost someone would understand completely. Another message came through. "I miss you. I'm sorry I didn't call more before. Can we talk soon?" I called the number immediately, hands trembling so badly I nearly dropped the phone twice trying to dial. It rang twice and then went to a generic automated voicemail message, the kind you get with a brand new, never personalized number, not my sister's old voicemail greeting, which I remembered word for word even 6 years later. I texted back, asking directly who this was, demanding an explanation, my fear giving way to something closer to anger by that point. No response came. Not that night, not the next day, not ever again. I called my phone provider the following morning, shaken but trying to sound composed, and asked if there was any way to find out who currently owned that number, or any records of how long it had been active under a different owner. They told me, after checking, that the number had been disconnected and unassigned for the past 6 years, since shortly after my sister's death, in fact, and was not currently active or assigned to any account at all, which meant, according to their own records, no living person should have been able to send a text from that number at all. I don't know what to do with that information. I've told very few people this story because I know exactly how it sounds, and because some part of me still isn't sure whether I want an explanation or whether I'm afraid of what the explanation might actually be. I still have the messages saved, screenshots dated and timestamped, sitting in a folder on my phone that I look at more often than I probably should. I've shown them to my closest friend, who has no explanation either, beyond the obvious, deeply unsettling possibility that I don't like to say out loud. I haven't received anything since that night, 8 months now, no matter how many times I've stared at my phone hoping, or dreading, that it might happen again. I don't know if I want it to happen again. I think about that message. I'm sorry I didn't call more before. More than I probably should, turning it over and over, wondering if there was something in it I was supposed to understand, some message underneath the message that I haven't figured out yet. I did eventually tell my parents about it, months later, after a lot of hesitation, worried it would reopen a wound that had barely begun to close for any of us. My mother's reaction surprised me. She didn't dismiss it, and she didn't seem frightened by it either. She just went very still, and then she told me something she'd never mentioned before, that in the weeks right after my sister's death, she herself had woken up more than once convinced she'd heard my sister's laugh coming from down the hallway, clear as anything, only to find every room empty when she checked. She'd never told anyone, assuming it was grief playing tricks on an exhausted, heartbroken mind, the same explanation I tried to give myself about the texts. Hearing her say it out loud, though matter-of-factly, like it was simply a fact of our lives now rather than something to be embarrassed about, made me feel less alone in it than I had in 8 months. I still haven't blocked that number. I tell myself it's because there's no point, since it's not actively assigned to anyone. But if I'm honest with myself late at night, staring at the ceiling, unable to sleep, I think the real reason is that some part of me is still waiting for it to happen again, and I'm not entirely sure whether that's a comfort or the most frightening thing about this entire story. Story 13. The Thing in the Walls. We bought an old farmhouse a few years back, the kind of property that real estate agents describe as having great bones, which we quickly learned is often code for, you will be doing renovations for the rest of your natural life. It had been empty for almost 2 years before we bought it, sitting on a large plot of rural land, and we got it for a price low enough that we should have asked more questions than we did. The renovations started ordinary enough, new flooring, updated plumbing, the standard headaches of restoring an old house. About 3 months into living there, while contractors were doing electrical work in the walls of the upstairs hallway, one of the sounds continued anyway. Slow, deliberate movement inside the walls, mostly at night, mostly concentrated in that same upstairs hallway. A kind of shifting, scraping sound, like something large repositioning itself in a very confined space. I started sleeping poorly, lying awake listening to it, telling myself every single night that it was settling, old pipes, anything but what my gut was increasingly telling me it might be. About 5 months in, my wife woke me up in the middle of the night, absolutely certain she'd heard breathing coming from inside the wall directly behind our headboard. Not our breathing. Something slower, deeper, with an unsettling rasp to it. I lay there with her, both of us frozen, listening, and I heard it too, unmistakable rhythmic breathing, coming from somewhere inside a wall that, according to every blueprint and inspection we'd had done, was solid, insulated, with no cavity large enough to hide anything bigger than a small animal. We had a contractor come back out and actually open up a section of that wall, needing to know once and for all what was in there. What they found made no sense to any of us and honestly still doesn't. The wall cavity was completely empty. No animal, no nest, nothing. But there was a section of the original wall, clearly much older than the rest of the house's construction, that had been sealed off separately at some point in the house's history. A hidden space, roughly the size of a small closet, built into the wall itself and then drywalled over completely with no door, no access point, no way in or out at all. We opened it up fully, and inside we found almost nothing. A few rotted scraps of what might have once been fabric, and scratched deeply into the wooden support beam at the back of that hidden space, dozens of long, deliberate scratch marks, running floor to ceiling, the kind of marks that take a very long time and a very desperate effort to make. We contacted the County Historical Society, trying to understand what we were looking at, and after some research, they found records suggesting the house had, at some point roughly a century earlier, briefly been used to informally shelter. The records were vague, frustratingly so, using outdated and uncomfortable language. A family member who was, in the language of that era, kept out of sight rather than properly cared for. The kind of quiet, shameful family secret that many old houses from that period apparently hold somewhere within their walls, sealed away and mostly forgotten by history. We never found conclusive proof of what exactly happened in that space, or to whom, and the Historical Society's records only went so far before trailing off into speculation. But the breathing, the shifting, the slow, deliberate movement inside our walls, all of it stopped completely the moment we opened that hidden space up and exposed it to open air for the first time in what was likely close to 100 years. We sealed the wall back up properly this time with a small access panel rather than blind drywall, out of some instinct neither my wife nor I could fully articulate. A sense that leaving it accessible, acknowledged rather than hidden away and forgotten again, mattered somehow. We haven't heard anything since. I don't know if what we experienced was something supernatural, some lingering echo of genuine suffering that happened in that space long before we ever arrived, or something else entirely that I don't have the language to properly describe. But I know that house feels different now. Lighter, somehow, in a way I can't fully explain to anyone who hasn't lived through something like it. We still live there. We raised our kids there. There's one last detail I think about more than any other. The night after we finished opening that wall properly and installing the small access panel, before we'd even had a chance to clean out the last of the debris, my wife found something tucked into a gap between two of the old support beams that the contractors had somehow missed. A small, tarnished locket, the chain long since disintegrated, but the locket itself still intact enough to open. Inside, barely visible beneath a century of tarnish, was a tiny, faded photograph of a young woman, and on the reverse side of the locket, scratched by hand rather than professionally engraved, a single initial and a date, decades older than the house's official construction records suggested it should have been. We never identified who she was. We buried the locket quietly, out past the tree line at the edge of our property, in a spot we chose together without needing to discuss why it felt like the right thing to do. And on quiet nights, when the house settles the way old houses do, I find myself listening carefully to the walls, just for a moment, just to make sure. It's always quiet now. I hope, for our sake and honestly for whoever might have been trapped in that space a century ago, that it stays that way. That's all 13 stories for tonight. If any of these stayed with you, if you found yourself checking a rearview mirror, or listening a little too closely to the walls of your own house, that's exactly the reaction I was hoping for. If you have a true story of your own, something that stuck with you and never quite left, I'd genuinely love to hear it in the comments below. Some of the best stories I've ever covered started that way. Subscribe if you made it this far, because that means you've got the stomach for this channel, and I've got a lot more where these came from. Until next time, sleep well if you can.